again, everybody. We are going to be doing two lectures this week. Both are kind of based in the um, philosophical discourse of phenomenology. The first lecture is going to be concerned primarily with critics who have worked phenomenology more or less directly into their mode of criticism. And the second is going to be on a kind of another offshoot known as reception theory, which is primarily concerned with how audiences consume and interpret text. So the first set of essays we're going to be looking at today are Georges Poulet's The Phenomenology of Reading and Emmanuel Levinas's Ethics of the Face. So ethics is also going to be a concern of our discussion and how ethics relates to literature. So let's start with a brief history of phenomenology, and we'll move from there. So phenomenology doesn't really have a name until the early 20th century, but its origins are in the late 18th century with the Prussian philosopher Immanuel Kant. Yes, I know if you look Kant up on Wikipedia or anywhere else online, it's going to call him a German philosopher. There was no such place as Germany when Kant was alive. The country did not exist. So we will call him a Prussian philosopher because Königsberg, where he was born, was in Prussia. So Kant had been reading the work of empiricist philosophers like John Locke and David Hume, who argued that our minds are essentially blank slates that take in sense impressions, and that all we can know for certain are the things that our senses tell us. Now, Kant felt there was something missing from this account of human consciousness, right? It's like, well, if my mind is a blank slate, how is it that I am able to order my experience chronologically and in space, right? I can perceive time and space, but not directly through a direct sensory encounter, right? I have to process my sensory encounter, my sensory experiences, in order to know things like time and space, right? So there are these things that have only a kind of mental or intellectual existence, right? These essences that exist really only in our minds, that we're still able to comprehend, right? So for Kant, our senses collect information which our minds, through the process of reason, are able to order temporally and spatially. And those ordered sense impressions are then subjected to principles of reason in order to catalog our experience, right? This is how we're able to give someone a chronicle of what we did day to day, right? We can kind of turn our personal experience into a kind of narrative because our mind is able to perform this ordering function. So Kant divides mental objects up into kind of like two categories, right? There's what he calls phenomena, which are the actual objects of sensory experience translated into our minds, and noumena. And noumena are existences that we only comprehend within the mind. They're never perceived as things in themselves. So like, you know, this desk, right, the top of this desk, Kant would call it kind of a phenomenon, right? A phenomenon. You know, this is a physical thing that I can sense, that I can get a picture of in my brain. Noumena refers to things like time and space that aren't real physical things that we can directly experience through our senses. Right? These things that we have to construct in our minds based on sense experience. So in Kant's Critique of Judgments, published in 1790, the points in the former slide from his Critique of Pure Reason of 1781. The Critique of Judgments attempts to apply the same technique to aesthetics and ethics, right? So for Kant, aesthetic judgments are totally subjective, right? We might try to base them on principles of universal reason or think we're basing them on principles of universal reason, but it's really only about what kinds of sense experiences we enjoy, right? He uses this phrase, purposefulness without purpose, to argue that art only pretends to have a purpose behind it, right? It's activity that looks meaningful, that looks purposeful, but in fact has no direct purpose. Well, ethical judgments are totally rational and should be based on universal principles that apply to everyone at all times, right? So this should be what guides our behavior towards others, right? Universal principles that apply to all human beings in all cultures at all historical periods, right? Still with me? Good. Now, the first real phenomenologist, right, the first person to kind of codify phenomenology as a philosophical field is the Austrian-German Jewish philosopher Edmund Husserl. So Husserl wrote in the late 19th and early 20th centuries in opposition to a philosophical movement called positivism. So positivists believed, kind of like the 18th century empiricists, that knowledge consists only of empirically verifiable facts, right? That facts and data, that's knowledge. That's what we can know. And knowledge should be measured by its usefulness, not by whether or not we can relate it to universal principles that relate to all people at all times. But Husserl then goes and asks, if there are no universal principles, then how are human beings to make ethical judgments, right? If all there is data, right? If all there is empirically verifiable facts, there is nothing else. Nothing else constitutes knowledge. Then how are we supposed to determine how we behave properly towards other people, other beings in the world, right? So he regards this as kind of the central problem of positivism, right? The thing that it ignores. So phenomenology is his response to this problem. So he uses Kant's old term phenomena to refer to mental objects that replicate things we experience in the world. So this involves the transformation of our sense impressions into universal principles. The things we imagine when we think about a particular kind of object are phenomena, right? They're not things that exist in themselves. Right? Like when I think of this table, or when this person thinks of a cup, right? They're not thinking of an actual physical cup. They're building a mental construct of a cup or a table based on their experience of these things. So if this kind of sounds a little bit like Plato, yeah, it does, but it's coming from the other direction, right? So Plato believed that everything all sensory objects are imitations of ideas. Right? So the idea comes first, and then we get the object. A phenomenologist like Husserl believes that the thing comes first, and then we kind of extrapolate an idea of the thing from our actual sensory experiences, right? So truth is to be found in our ideas of things that our minds extract from sensory data, not just from the data itself, right? So in defining consciousness, a phenomenologist argues that consciousness always has to be consciousness of something, right? In order to be conscious, you have to be conscious of something. So consciousness exists only in a world that can be experienced through our senses, right? On some level. This is how we build consciousness. We build consciousness through our experience of a life world. And the world, or this life world, is the sum total of objects that can be sensed, right? That can be experienced, right? That's the world that we are conscious of. Now, before we can truly experience the world as phenomena, like an experience that phenomenologists call folk. Damn it. Hold on. Wasn't quite ready for that yet. Shouldn't have tapped the board. We have to reject all of our preconceptions and assumptions about the things that we're experiencing. This is kind of like Rene Descartes in his meditations, kind of like trying to strip away all of the things he thinks he knows to get back to first principles, right? So the first principle that he comes to when he strips away all of his past experience and past knowledge is that, okay, thinking is equivalent to being, right? I think, therefore I am. This is an example of epoch, of this kind of rejection of preconceived notions and ideas before we can really start to experience the world as phenomenon. So this is a list of some of the important texts in the history of phenomenology going back to the 18th century. So probably the first, as I noted, important phenomenologist philosopher, even though he wouldn't have recognized himself as such, is Immanuel Kant. His Critique of Pure Reason of 1781 and his Critique of Judgments of 1790. Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, if you want to really take your mind on a trip, you should check out the Phenomenology of Mind of 1801 and the Philosophy of Mind of 1830. You probably won't understand it. I'll admit that I don't. But you know, give it a go. See what happens. Husserl's Ideas, published in 1913, is really the beginning of modern phenomenology, the kind of phenomenology we're talking about. Husserl's student, Martin Heidegger, has a reputation that is tainted by, well, frankly, by Nazism. But as being in time of 1927 is also a key text in this tradition. Then, as we apply this to literary criticism, the key texts are Jean-Pierre Richard's Literature and Sensation of 1954, Georges Poulet's Studies in Human Time of 1956, Gaston Bachelard's Poetics of Space, 1957, and phenomenology as an ethical phenomenon is probably best described in Emmanuel Levinas's book, Totality and Infinity of 1961. So let's talk a little bit about the Geneva School of Literary Criticism. That's the school that Poulet is coming out of. And the reason I have chosen this image of Taylor Swift here is that, okay, I'm going to be honest, like, I don't really get it, right? I don't get the Swiftie obsession. I don't really understand why people are willing to pay thousands of dollars and travel to far-flung places to get tickets to see a pop star who, to my ears, writes, frankly pleasant wallpaper music, but she seems to have some kind of intimate connection with the consciousness of her fans, right? And that's kind of what the Geneva critics were after, right? Is bridging the consciousness of the author and the reader through the medium of text, right? The sharing of the author's consciousness with the reader through the literary work. So this is a school that's prominent in the 1950s and 60s. And it's called the Geneva School because most of these critics were associated in some way with the University of Geneva in Switzerland. Some were not. Gaston Bachelard was not. Georges Poulet, who we read for this session, was not. But yeah, the basic argument that these guys are making in the 50s and 60s, that they're influenced by the Russian formalists and by Husserl's phenomenology, although I think phenomenology is the bigger, deeper influence. The big argument is that the literary text is a representation of an author's consciousness and relationship to the world, right? So the literary text contains what these critics call a life world, right? Based on the author's relationship to objects in the world. This is not the same thing as biographical criticism. On the whole, they're not that interested in biography. They're not a school of critics that view all writing as a form of autobiography. Rather, they see the literary text, as I said, as a sharing of a temporal and spatial experience of a given reality that's contained within the boundaries of the text. It's not an account of events in an author's life, right? It's more the author sharing their experience of phenomena with you, if this makes sense. And I hope it does. So, meet Georges Poulet in his old age. He is was a Belgian literary critic. And he was one of the primary movers in this Geneva School idea of the literary text as a bridge between consciousnesses. It's a way for the author and the reader to share in the experience of consciousness. So the text, as we said when we talked about Geneva School for Poulet, is a representation of the author's experience of phenomena in the world. The term that phenomenologist critics use for this is life world. These phenomenologist critics, by the way, are also sometimes referred to as critics of consciousness. So, like a structuralist, Poulet believes that the text kind of lies dormant until it's activated by a reader. But the way the reader activates the text is different here. So remember that for structuralists, authors basically don't exist, right? There's no author. There's a subject who organizes a set of conventions and codes that the competent reader recognizes as they approach the text, right? For a critic of consciousness, what happens is that the author creates a series of kind of interior objects in a life world represented in the text that lack full existence until they are experienced by a reader, right? So the objects contained within the life world of the text don't fully exist until someone sits down and reads the text. So Poulet uses the phrase thinking the thoughts of another to describe the process of reading, right? So reading gives us a chance to merge our consciousness with an author's, right? So this is an act of sharing and cooperation, not of dominance or possession, right? We don't give our consciousness over to the author. Rather, what we do is fulfill the promise of the author's life world, that we bring the life world into reality by experiencing the phenomena on the page in our minds. Now, we can also relate this to ethical approaches to text. So I'm a big fan of black and white photos of elderly French philosophers looking grumpy. And here we have just such a photo of the Lithuanian French Jewish philosopher and ethicist Emmanuel Levinas. So Levinas's phenomenology is primarily concerned with the realm of ethics and how we're supposed to behave with other people, right? So the other, Levinas defines as that which cannot be assimilated to the self, right? That which always exists outside the boundaries of the self. And he uses the term alterity to describe the condition of being other. So if you're looking at things from the position of the other, right, this is a moment of alterity, right? And one thing that a text allows us to do, or literary work allows us to do, is experience the world through the eyes of the other. So for Levinas, ethics are really about our responsibility to others, right? We can only encounter the other as phenomena, right? It's a mental construct we build up through sensory experience. But those relationships with others, right, with those who are not ourselves, are governed by discourse, right, by a kind of specialized form of conversation. So this is how Levinas defines discourse, and I'll try to boil this down for you into less abstruse language. But Levinas says that discourse is an original, non-allergic, ethical relationship with alterity, productive of a meaning, capable of founding communal meaning. Get all that? I'll give you a minute. Good. Okay, so what Levinas is talking about here is simply conversations between others, right? Uses of language between others that are used to find common ground and build responsible ethical relationships, right? Basically, we learn to know the other. We learn how to treat the other through discourse rather than through simple sensory experience of the other as a phenomenon, right? Okay, so I'm sure you are asking, right, this is all well and good, but how do I apply this, right? What am I supposed to do with all of this? Well, let's return to James Joyce's The Dead. Now, there are a couple of ways we can read this phenomenologically. One is to do the kind of Levinasian ethical reading, right? We can see The Dead as a series of Gabriel Conroy's encounters with others, and with in a way, kind of like an account of his failures to assimilate the other, not to assimilate it, but to understand the other's experience, right? Until the end of the story, when he finally, through conversation, through discourse, draws out his wife Greta to get her account of this boy Michael Fury she knew before she met Gabriel. Right? This is a moment of real ethical understanding and ethical connection for Gabriel, whose eyes are then filled with generous tears, right? And who has then several realizations about himself, having had this experience with his wife, right? One that is not centered on his own needs and desires. You could also, if you wanted to follow Poulet rather than Levinas, you could examine the way Gabriel Conroy experiences sensory phenomena, right? So the guy is a serious aesthete. He's always enjoying some form of sensory experience, right? Whether he's putting his fingers up against a cold window pane and enjoying that kind of icy tingling sensation, whether he's thinking about the appearance and smell of a heliotrope envelope, or the touch of his wife's hand or the brush of her hair, right? When he's sitting, kind of having a reverie as he listens to the tenor Bartle Darcy sing the last walk rim, right? So if you could pay attention to the way Gabriel experiences these sensory moments and builds them into mental objects or mental pictures. The other thing you might do is look at the way the text shares a particular life world, right? That of middle-class Catholic Dublin around the turn of the 20th century, right? How does this relate to us, the author's experience of this particular context, right? What does this context look like as a series of phenomena and noumena, right? So these are all things you could try to do with this. These are ways you could approach a specific text from a phenomenological perspective. So, for the discussion board this week, here's how you might approach Poulet and Levinas here, right? So you might choose a favorite text of yours and describe the life world of phenomena shared by the author. And try to explain how reading this text helps you to share in the author's experience of processing the sensory data. Right? How does it let you share in the author's mind? You might also examine the way a text of your own choosing deals with relationship between the self, right, in this case the narrative consciousness, and one or more others. To what extent do these relationships use language to try to build some kind of common ground? This would be a Levinasian reading, right? And you might also want to try to think about the limitations of this, right? Are there texts in which the life world represented by the author is difficult or impossible for the reader to enter? Do you think it's always possible or desirable to share in the author's consciousness when you read? Why or why not? All right, so next lecture will be on reader response and reception theory. These are two names for a very similar way of reading. So we'll see you then. All right, take care, everybody.